Have you ever wondered why you keep making the same mistakes over and over again? Why no matter how much you promise yourself things will be different, you find yourself trapped in identical patterns of behavior, identical relationship dynamics, identical self-destructive choices? Perhaps it's that voice in your head that whispers you're not good enough just as you're about to succeed, or the inexplicable rage that surfaces when someone challenges your ideas, even when deep down you know they might be right. Maybe it's the way you judge others with surprising harshness for traits you claim not to possess yourself. The envy you feel but refuse to acknowledge when someone achieves what you secretly desire. The fear that paralyzes you from taking risks, even though you can't explain why safety feels like a prison. What if I told you that none of this is accidental? That there's an invisible force operating in the depths of your psyche, orchestrating these patterns, pulling the strings of your emotions, and sabotaging your conscious efforts to grow? Carl Jung called this force the shadow, the hidden repository of everything you've rejected about yourself. Your shadow contains all the emotions, desires, impulses, and aspects of your personality that you learned were unacceptable. Everything you buried to gain love, approval, and social acceptance. Everything you disowned to maintain your self-image as a good person. But here's the terrifying truth. What you refuse to acknowledge doesn't disappear. It goes underground and controls your life from there. Jung discovered that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Your shadow doesn't just influence your behavior, it determines your relationships, sabotages your success, creates your fears, and keeps you trapped in cycles you can't break. And the more you ignore it, the more destructive it becomes. Today, we're going to explore why your shadow might be the most important aspect of your psychology you've never properly understood. We'll uncover how it operates, why it's destroying your life, and most importantly, how you can transform it from a hidden enemy into your greatest source of power. This journey won't be comfortable. Shadow work requires looking at parts of yourself you've spent years avoiding. But if you're tired of feeling stuck, tired of repeating the same patterns, tired of sabotaging yourself just when things start going well, then this might be the most important video you ever watch. Are you ready to meet the part of yourself you've been running from your entire life? The birth of your shadow. The creation of your shadow began before you could even speak. From the moment you entered this world, you were subjected to a process of psychological conditioning that would determine which parts of yourself were acceptable and which had to be hidden away forever. As a young child, you were naturally whole. You expressed anger when frustrated, sadness when hurt, joy when happy, fear when threatened. You were selfish when you needed something, generous when you felt abundant, aggressive when protecting yourself, vulnerable when you needed comfort. You were authentically, completely human. But then the shaping began. Don't be angry. Stop crying. Don't be so selfish. Nice children share. Big boys don't show fear. Good girls don't get upset. With each command, each disapproving look, each withdrawal of love when you expressed certain emotions, you learned that parts of yourself were dangerous. So you did what any intelligent child would do. You adapted. You learned to hide your anger behind smiles, your sadness behind cheerfulness, your selfishness behind excessive giving, your aggression behind compliance. You created what Jung called a persona, a socially acceptable mask that would ensure you received the love and approval you desperately needed. But where did all those rejected aspects go? They didn't disappear. They were pushed down into the unconscious, where they formed what Jung called the shadow, a hidden repository of everything you learned was unacceptable about yourself. Your shadow became a storage facility for your disowned humanity. The tragic irony is that many of the qualities you banished to your shadow weren't actually negative. Your anger might have been appropriate boundary setting. Your selfishness might have been healthy self-care. Your aggression might have been necessary self-protection. But because they were labeled as bad, they were buried alive in your unconscious. Jung understood that this process is not just individual, it's cultural. Every society has its own collective shadow, its own list of unacceptable traits that get repressed. In some cultures, emotional expression is forbidden. In others, ambition is discouraged. In still others, vulnerability is seen as weakness. We inherit not just our personal shadows, but collective ones. The creation of your shadow was necessary for social survival, but it came at an enormous cost. By rejecting aspects of yourself, you became fragmented, incomplete, divided against yourself. You learned to present only certain facets of your personality while keeping others locked away in darkness. And here's where the real problem begins. Your shadow didn't accept its banishment quietly. Denied direct expression, it found other ways to influence your life. It began operating from the unconscious, shaping your choices, relationships, and reactions in ways you couldn't see or understand. The very qualities you rejected began to control you from behind the scenes. The anger you couldn't express became passive aggression. The selfishness you couldn't acknowledge became people-pleasing that bred resentment. The vulnerability you couldn't show became emotional walls that prevented intimacy. Jung realized that the shadow doesn't just contain your negative qualities. It contains your unrealized potential, your authentic power, your creative energy. When you reject parts of yourself, you don't just lose access to problematic behaviors. You lose access to essential aspects of your humanity. Understanding the birth of your shadow is crucial because it helps you recognize that these rejected aspects aren't foreign invaders. They're exiled parts of yourself, waiting to be reclaimed and integrated. The very qualities that seem to sabotage you from the unconscious could become your greatest strengths if brought into conscious awareness. How your shadow controls you. Your shadow operates like a master puppeteer, pulling strings you can't see to create patterns you can't understand. It doesn't announce itself or demand attention directly. Instead, it works through subtle manipulation, unconscious influence, and what Jung called autonomous complexes, psychological subsystems that can take control of your behavior without your conscious permission. One of the most common ways your shadow controls you is through projection. When you encounter someone who embodies a quality you've rejected in yourself, your shadow causes you to have an intense emotional reaction. You become inexplicably irritated, angry, or disgusted, not because of what they're doing, but because they're reflecting something you refuse to acknowledge in yourself. Have you ever had a disproportionately strong reaction to someone's arrogance, their neediness, their anger, their ambition? These intense responses are often your shadow speaking. The very qualities that trigger you most strongly in others are frequently the ones you've most thoroughly repressed in yourself. Your shadow also controls you through what Jung called enantiodromia, the tendency for repressed content to manifest as its opposite. If you've completely rejected your capacity for selfishness, you might become compulsively selfless, giving until you're depleted and then resenting others for not appreciating your sacrifice. If you've banished all traces of aggression, you might become a people pleaser who's terrified of conflict, yet unconsciously creates drama through passive-aggressive behavior. If you've rejected your vulnerability, you might become hyper-independent, unable to ask for help even when you desperately need it. Shadow control also manifests through repetitive patterns you can't seem to break. You find yourself attracted to the same type of partner who ultimately hurts you. You sabotage yourself just as you're about to succeed. You create the same conflicts in every relationship. These patterns feel like fate, but they're actually your shadow recreating familiar dynamics. Jung discovered that the shadow often operates through what he called compensation. If your conscious personality is extremely orderly, your shadow might create chaos. If you present yourself as perpetually positive, your shadow might manifest through depression or cynicism that you can't explain. Your shadow also controls you through limiting beliefs that feel like absolute truths. I'm not the type of person who, I could never. People like me don't. These statements aren't facts about reality. They're manifestations of shadow material that has convinced you certain aspects of life are off limits. Perhaps most destructively, your shadow controls you through self-sabotage. Just as you're about to achieve something significant, break through to a new level, or step into your power, your shadow activates. Suddenly, you procrastinate, make poor choices, create conflicts, or find ways to ensure you fail. This isn't weakness. It's your shadow protecting you from becoming someone your unconscious mind believes you're not allowed to be. The shadow's control extends to your relationship patterns. If your shadow contains deep wounds around abandonment, you might unconsciously choose partners who will eventually leave. If it holds unprocessed anger, you might attract people who give you reasons to be angry. If it carries shame, you might create relationships that reinforce that shame. Jung understood that shadow control is particularly powerful because it operates below the threshold of consciousness. You experience its effects, the patterns, the reactions, the self-sabotage, but you can't see the mechanism creating them. You feel like a victim of circumstances when you're actually being controlled by aspects of yourself you've refused to acknowledge. The most insidious aspect of shadow control is that it masquerades as protection. Your shadow will convince you that avoiding certain experiences, emotions, or opportunities is keeping you safe, when it's actually keeping you trapped in a narrow version of yourself. The signs your shadow is running your life. How can you tell if your shadow has taken control of your life? The signs are everywhere once you know what to look for, but they're often so familiar that you mistake them for normal parts of your personality. Jung understood that the shadow's influence is most dangerous when it's completely unconscious, operating without any awareness from the ego. The first major sign is emotional reactivity that seems disproportionate to the situation. You find yourself having strong reactions to people or situations that shouldn't bother you that much. Someone's confidence irritates you beyond reason. Another person's success triggers intense envy. Someone's vulnerability makes you uncomfortable or contemptuous. These reactions point directly to shadow content. If someone's behavior creates an emotional charge in you that feels bigger than the situation warrants, they're likely reflecting something you've rejected in yourself. Your shadow is using them as a screen onto which it projects its disowned material. Another clear sign is repetitive life patterns that seem to happen to you rather than being created by you. You keep attracting the same type of toxic relationship. You repeatedly sabotage yourself just before achieving success. You find yourself in the same conflicts over and over again, just with different people. These patterns persist because your shadow is unconsciously recreating familiar dynamics. If your shadow contains unresolved trauma around betrayal, you'll unconsciously choose situations where betrayal is likely. If it holds beliefs about your unworthiness, you'll create experiences that confirm that unworthiness. Chronic self-sabotage is perhaps the clearest indicator of shadow control. You procrastinate on important projects. You pick fights with people you care about just when the relationship is deepening. You make impulsive decisions that undermine your long-term goals. You find ways to fail just as success becomes possible. This self-sabotage isn't masochistic. It's your shadow's way of maintaining psychological homeostasis. If your unconscious mind believes you don't deserve success, love, or happiness, it will find ways to ensure you don't achieve or maintain these states. Perfectionism and people-pleasing often indicate strong shadow repression. If you can't tolerate making mistakes, showing weakness, or disappointing others, you've likely buried essential parts of your humanity in your shadow. The more perfect your persona, the more volatile your shadow becomes. Chronic feelings of emptiness or numbness can also signal shadow repression. When you've rejected so many aspects of yourself, you lose access to the full spectrum of human experience. You might feel like you're going through the motions of life without really living, performing rather than experiencing. Addictive behaviors, whether to substances, work, relationships, or activities, often represent shadow material seeking expression. The addiction becomes a way for repressed aspects of yourself to emerge indirectly. The workaholic might be expressing buried ambition. The relationship addict might be accessing forbidden dependency needs. Extreme judgments about others frequently indicate projected shadow material. If you find yourself being harshly critical of people who display certain traits, those traits likely exist in your own unconscious. The intensity of your judgment reveals the strength of your repression. Physical symptoms without clear medical causes can sometimes be manifestations of shadow energy seeking expression. Jung understood that psychological content that can't be processed mentally often expresses itself through the body. Chronic tension, unexplained fatigue, or recurring symptoms might carry shadow material. Dreams filled with dark figures, being chased, or scenarios where you're acting out of character often feature shadow content. Your unconscious mind uses dreams to process repressed material, so paying attention to these nocturnal dramas can reveal what your shadow contains. Perhaps the most subtle sign is a persistent feeling that something is missing from your life, even when things are going well. This emptiness often reflects the absence of shadow integration. You're living as only part of yourself, and some essential aspect of your humanity remains unconscious and unexpressed. The cost of shadow denial. What happens when you spend years or decades refusing to acknowledge your shadow? The cost isn't just psychological, it reverberates through every aspect of your life, creating a cascade of problems that seem unrelated, but all stem from the same source: the energy required to maintain unconsciousness. The most immediate cost is psychological fragmentation. When you reject aspects of yourself, you literally become divided against yourself. Part of your energy goes toward maintaining your acceptable persona, while another part goes toward suppressing your unacceptable shadow. This creates internal conflict that depletes your resources and leaves you feeling exhausted without understanding why. Jung observed that shadow denial creates what he called psychological possession. When you refuse to acknowledge certain aspects of yourself, they don't disappear. They become autonomous, acting without your conscious control. You might find yourself saying things you didn't mean to say, reacting in ways that surprise you, or making decisions that contradict your stated values. Shadow denial also costs you authentic relationships. When you present only your acceptable qualities to others, you prevent them from knowing and loving your whole self. Your relationships become performances rather than genuine connections. You might be surrounded by people but feel fundamentally alone because no one knows who you really are. The energy cost of maintaining shadow repression is enormous. Consider how much mental energy you spend monitoring your thoughts, controlling your reactions, and managing your image. This constant vigilance leaves less energy available for creativity, growth, and authentic self-expression. Shadow denial also limits your capacity for empathy and understanding. When you can't acknowledge certain qualities in yourself, you can't truly understand them in others. Your ability to relate to the full spectrum of human experience becomes restricted, making your relationships and understanding more superficial. Perhaps most tragically, shadow denial cuts you off from your own power and potential. Many of the qualities you've banished to your shadow aren't negative. They're aspects of yourself that were labeled as unacceptable by your family or culture. Your authentic assertiveness might have been called aggression. Your natural confidence might have been called arrogance. When you deny these qualities, you lose access to essential life skills. You can't set boundaries effectively if you've rejected your assertiveness. You can't pursue your goals confidently if you've banished your ambition. You can't protect yourself if you've disowned your aggression. Shadow denial also creates what Jung called inflation and deflation cycles. When shadow material breaks through your conscious control, it often manifests in extreme ways. The person who's never allowed themselves to be angry might explode in rage. The person who's rejected their sexuality might act out compulsively. These eruptions are often followed by periods of deflation and shame, reinforcing the belief that these aspects of yourself are dangerous and must be more carefully controlled. This creates a vicious cycle where repression leads to explosion, which leads to more repression. Shadow denial also costs you the ability to learn from your mistakes and grow from your experiences. If you can't acknowledge the parts of yourself that contributed to problems, you can't address them. You remain stuck in patterns because you can't see your role in creating them. On a broader level, collective shadow denial contributes to social problems. When entire groups refuse to acknowledge their capacity for hatred, violence, or prejudice, these qualities don't disappear. They get projected onto other groups, creating the foundation for conflict, discrimination, and war. The ultimate cost of shadow denial is that you never become fully yourself. You live as a fragment of your potential, expressing only the qualities that were deemed acceptable while keeping vast territories of your psyche unexplored. You die without ever having met yourself completely. The path to shadow integration. Shadow integration isn't about eliminating your shadow or becoming perfect. It's about developing a conscious relationship with all aspects of yourself, including the ones you've learned to fear or reject. Jung understood that wholeness comes not from purification, but from integration, not from becoming purely good, but from becoming fully human. The first step in shadow integration is recognition. You must begin to identify when your shadow is operating. This requires developing what Jung called conscious observation, the ability to watch your own reactions, patterns, and behaviors with curiosity rather than judgment. Pay attention to your emotional triggers. When someone provokes a strong reaction in you, ask yourself, what quality are they displaying that I might have rejected in myself? If someone's confidence bothers you, explore whether you've suppressed your own confidence. If someone's vulnerability makes you uncomfortable, consider whether you've rejected your own vulnerability. The next step is reclaiming projected content. Instead of focusing on what's wrong with others, turn your attention inward. When you catch yourself being harshly critical of someone, ask, how might this quality exist in me? This doesn't mean becoming self-attacking, but rather becoming curious about your own complexity. Jung recommended what he called active imagination, a process of deliberately engaging with your shadow through visualization, dialogue, or creative expression. You might imagine meeting the aspects of yourself you've rejected and having conversations with them. What do they want? What do they need? What wisdom do they carry? Shadow integration also requires what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. Instead of trying to eliminate conflicting aspects of yourself, you learn to hold them simultaneously. You can be both confident and humble, both independent and dependent, both strong and vulnerable. This process requires tremendous self-compassion. The qualities you've rejected were often banished for good reasons. They threatened your survival in your family or social system. Approaching your shadow with curiosity and kindness rather than judgment is essential for successful integration. Practical shadow work involves creating space for the expression of rejected qualities in healthy ways. If you've suppressed anger, you might need to learn assertiveness skills. If you've rejected your sexuality, you might need to explore sensuality safely. If you've banished your ambition, you might need to practice goal setting. Jung emphasized that shadow integration is an ongoing process, not a one-time achievement. As you grow and change, new aspects of your shadow may emerge. What you could integrate at one stage of life might need to be revisited as you face new challenges and opportunities. Dreams often provide valuable information about shadow content. Figures in your dreams who frighten, disgust, or fascinate you frequently represent shadow aspects seeking integration. Instead of dismissing these dream figures, try to understand what they might represent about rejected parts of yourself. Body awareness can also facilitate shadow integration. Many rejected qualities express themselves through physical tension, posture, or movement. Learning to feel and express yourself through your body can help you access shadow material that might not be available through thinking alone. The goal of shadow integration isn't to become someone different, but to become more fully yourself. As you reclaim rejected aspects of your personality, you gain access to a broader range of responses and resources. You become more flexible, more creative, and more resilient. Integrated individuals don't lose their capacity for discernment or appropriate behavior. Instead, they develop conscious choice about when and how to express different aspects of themselves. They can access their anger when boundaries need to be set, their vulnerability when intimacy is appropriate, their assertiveness when leadership is required. Shadow integration and authentic power. When you successfully integrate your shadow, something remarkable happens. You gain access to what Jung called authentic power, the ability to act from your whole self rather than just your acceptable parts. This power doesn't come from dominance or control over others, but from internal integration and self-mastery. Authentic power emerges when you're no longer divided against yourself. The energy that was previously consumed by internal conflict becomes available for creative action. You stop sabotaging yourself because all parts of your psyche are aligned toward your conscious goals. People who have integrated their shadow possess a quality that's immediately recognizable. They seem comfortable in their own skin. They don't need to prove anything or hide anything. They can acknowledge their flaws without being destroyed by them and own their strengths without being inflated by them. Shadow integration also brings what Jung called psychological sovereignty, the ability to think and feel for yourself rather than being unconsciously controlled by complexes, projections, or social conditioning. You become less reactive and more responsive, able to choose your reactions rather than being controlled by them. This sovereignty extends to your relationships. When you're not projecting your shadow onto others, you can see them more clearly. You become less likely to attract or be attracted to people who carry your projections, and more likely to form relationships based on genuine compatibility and mutual respect. Integrated individuals also develop what Jung called creative adaptation, the ability to respond to new situations with fresh approaches rather than repeating old patterns. Because they have access to their full psychological range, they can draw on whatever qualities the situation requires. Perhaps most importantly, shadow integration leads to what Jung considered the ultimate goal of psychological development: individuation. This is the process of becoming your authentic self rather than the self your family, culture, or society expected you to be. Individuation doesn't mean becoming selfish or disconnected from others. Instead, it means becoming so fully yourself that you can relate to others from a place of wholeness rather than neediness. You can love without losing yourself, contribute without depleting yourself, and lead without dominating others. Shadow integration also brings a paradoxical sense of humility. When you acknowledge your own capacity for what you previously judged in others, you become less judgmental and more compassionate. You recognize that everyone is struggling with their own shadow material, and this understanding creates space for genuine empathy. The creative benefits of shadow integration are enormous. Many artists, writers, and innovators have discovered that their most powerful work emerges when they're willing to explore their darker territories. The shadow contains not just rejected negative qualities, but also repressed creative potential. Integrated individuals often report feeling more energetic and alive. This makes sense when you consider how much energy was previously consumed by internal conflict and repression. When you're no longer fighting against parts of yourself, that energy becomes available for growth, creativity, and contribution. Shadow integration also leads to what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to bridge opposites and find creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems. When you can hold conflicting aspects of yourself simultaneously, you develop the same capacity in other areas of life. The ultimate benefit of shadow integration is freedom, not the freedom to do whatever you want, but the freedom to be whoever you are. You're no longer imprisoned by unconscious patterns, compulsions, or the need to maintain a perfect image. You can respond to life authentically, creatively, and powerfully. The choice before you. You now stand at a crossroads that will determine the trajectory of your entire life. You can continue living as you have been, maintaining your acceptable persona while your shadow operates from the unconscious, creating patterns you can't understand and problems you can't solve. Or you can choose the more difficult but infinitely more rewarding path of shadow integration. Understand that this choice has profound implications. Continuing to ignore your shadow means accepting a life of partial authenticity, repetitive patterns, and missed potential. It means remaining vulnerable to unconscious control and never fully understanding why certain situations trigger you or why certain patterns persist. The path of shadow integration is more challenging, but leads to genuine freedom. It requires courage to face aspects of yourself you've spent years avoiding. It demands honesty about your role in creating your own problems. It asks you to give up the comfortable illusion that you're only your acceptable qualities. But this path also offers something invaluable, the chance to become whole, to live as your complete self rather than a fragment, to relate to others authentically rather than through projections, to respond to life from choice rather than compulsion. The work of shadow integration isn't a luxury or an interesting psychological experiment. It's essential for anyone who wants to live fully. Your shadow will influence your life whether you acknowledge it or not. The only question is whether that influence will be conscious and constructive or unconscious and destructive. Jung understood that most people will choose to remain unconscious. They'll continue projecting their shadow onto others, repeating the same patterns, and wondering why life feels so difficult. They'll blame circumstances, other people, or bad luck for problems that actually originate in their own unconscious. But you have the opportunity to be different. You can choose consciousness over unconsciousness, integration over fragmentation, authenticity over performance. You can decide to meet your whole self rather than remaining a stranger to your own depths. This choice isn't made once. It's made daily, moment by moment, in how you respond to triggers, how you relate to others, how you handle conflicts and challenges. Each time you choose curiosity over judgment about your reactions, you move toward integration. Each time you blame others for triggering you, you move toward unconsciousness. The process of shadow integration will change your relationships, your work, your goals, and your entire experience of life. Some people may not like the changes as you become more authentic and less people-pleasing. Some situations may no longer fit as you develop clearer boundaries and stronger values. But you'll also discover resources within yourself you never knew existed. You'll find that you're more creative, more powerful, more resilient, and more capable of genuine love than you imagined. You'll develop the ability to handle life's challenges from a place of wholeness rather than fragmentation. The ultimate question is, are you ready to meet yourself completely? Are you willing to embrace your full humanity, including the parts you've learned to fear? Can you find the courage to stop being a stranger to your own depths? Your shadow has been waiting your entire life for this recognition. The parts of yourself you've rejected are ready to be welcomed home. The integration process that could transform your life is available to you right now if you're willing to begin. The choice, as always, is yours. But remember, what you don't own will own you. What you don't integrate will control you. What you don't make conscious will direct your life from the shadows. If this video has revealed patterns in your life that you recognize, if you've seen how your shadow might be operating without your awareness, then you already know what you need to do. The only question is whether you'll have the courage to do it. Share in the comments below. What aspect of your shadow do you think you most need to integrate? What pattern in your life might be connected to rejected parts of yourself? Sometimes acknowledging these patterns publicly is the first step toward bringing them into consciousness. And if you're ready to go deeper into this work, make sure to watch the next video where we'll explore specific techniques for shadow integration and practical steps you can take to begin this transformative process. Remember, your shadow isn't your enemy. It's your unrealized self. The very qualities you've rejected might contain the keys to your liberation. The question is whether you're ready to reclaim them.